case, I can guarantee you that people on Wall Street could explain to you why it was that this was allowing us to better spread risk, to move risk to places where it could better be better taken care of. On the other hand, as it turns out, it also was a really good way of hiding risk and stealing money from people. And there's absolutely no question that, to a large extent, what the finance industry produced over the last few years was, at least to some extent, a giant Ponzi scheme. And so it's so the thing that these great economists were scratching their heads about was the question of just what we do with this sector, because perennially it engages in these Ponzi schemes, but we can't live without it. So it's going to be the big question for a lot of regulatory economists and a lot of other people over the next few years is how do we cut that pie.
To address your question about regulatory versus legislation, there was there were liquidity problems with all those products that they were pushing, and if there had been regulations about liquidity and some things were considered insurance instead of financial products, then a lot of the AIG problems and the other problems wouldn't have happened. So, it's just a matter of these new products that no one's seen before. They don't know how to regulate them, and there was no liquidity behind them that would have prevented a lot of the crashing from happening, I think, personally.
Next question.
Hi. Just going back to the State Street example that you came up with, not having enough the right employees, why you blame that on the government, not on the corporation that didn't foresee that proper time to notify the schools that this is what we need or we're going to need down the road?
I don't know that I didn't intend to lay all the blame on the government, but the question was, what can the government do to better promote economic development? And that's something the government could do more of in terms of its workforce development. I think business also has a role in getting the word out, and education. They all need to come together and have sufficient and efficient conversations to make sure that the pipeline of what people are studying and learning matches more closely with the kinds of jobs that are out there.
Another way to look at this is that instead of looking at this as a bad thing, that oh, we could have had all these jobs in the United States. Remember a little while ago I was talking about how the emergence of an international marketplace allows us to fill holes that might otherwise exist in our economy, and in some sense allow us to be more productive and allow us to get away with, say, higher levels of employment at lower rates of inflation, because we don't run into bottlenecks. And so one way of thinking about it is we lost all these jobs. Another way of thinking about it is that if we hadn't had the ability to go to China and Poland to fill those jobs, that we wouldn't have been able to produce those goods. The State Street Bank might have upped its charges for whatever those services are that it was producing through the roof, and we might have started seeing inflation that we might not have otherwise seen, and that might have put a stall on our growth.
Hi, I'm Franco. I'm the economics major undergraduate here on campus. My question, I'm really glad to hear that you're against industrial policy. But my question is, I guess, so we were talking about trade and its effects on the manufacturing sector. I've read a little bit about how countries like Singapore or Malaysia have developed, and it seems that they've focused maybe a little bit on their industrial sector, their manufacturing sector, but most of it comes from actually government intervention, not in the industrial sector per se, but in terms of the trade, in terms of their trade mechanisms, in terms of what they trade and how they trade. I just wanted to know what you, either if you think about like how the United States government at least would be able to maybe intervene not in the industrial sector but in trade in order to bolster our manufacturing again?
Well, what the United States does is a little bit different from what other countries do. Our trade policy, since time immemorial, everybody says, well, the United States has a free trade policy, and we try to push free trade on the world. But that's not entirely true. The United States is very well aware of what its particular interests are in freeing up trade. Every other country in the world is well aware of what their interests are in freeing up trade. For a long time, what that amounted to was, you lower your tariffs on the stuff we make, and we'll lower our tariffs on the stuff that you make, and that was a relatively easy thing to do, and was most of what the early progression of the trade rounds of the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, were about. More recently, we've gotten into much more thorny issues. We've gotten into places where it's not so much that there are most of the real among signatories to the GATT at this point, most of the tariff barriers to trade are gone. And rather the problems are that, well, we'd like it if instead of pirating all of the products of our entertainment industry, the rest of the world enforced our property rights in those things. And they would like it if we got rid of some of not our barriers to the import so much of agricultural goods, but our subsidies to our agricultural industries that everybody in the developed world has that probably tremendously disadvantage them. And then there's all bunches of little things like that. And so it's a little bit harder, a little bit more complicated than the old days of you lower your tariff and I'll lower mine. Because how to make those things commensurate is a much harder thing. And there are all sorts of thorny issues, more difficult issues around it than before. So the United States goes about this the same way everybody else does. We know where our interests are, intellectual property. They know where their interests are, and we go into trade negotiations and we try to pursue those things. What other countries do more of than we do not do is creating bargaining chips. So other countries are much more aggressive and much more strategic, I will argue, at actually creating regulations and creating non-tariff advantages for their domestic industries, which they can then bargain away. And the United States doesn't do as much of that as other countries do. And to the extent that we do it inadvertently through things like defense research and things like that. And from the perspective of our dealing with other developed countries, I don't think it would be a bad thing if we did a little more of that. Although, it tends to open up the can of worms that I was talking about. So, I wouldn't. You said I'm against industrial policy. That's not entirely true. I pursue it not because I thought that we would gain because by subsidizing our domestic industry, we'd gain all these jobs and everything like that. I do it to bargain it away.
One thing that's worth mentioning about industrial policy is that that's a term that applies to a basket of things, right? And some of them may be more effective than others. Some of them may be more subject to corruption than others. Some pieces of industrial policy may have more of an impact on a whole sector as opposed to particular individual companies. So that distinction is worth bringing out.
Well, nice all this. Mike was there.
Is it on? My name is Judy Potts, and I have really two questions, but I think they boil down to one. One of the things you said was that people are out of work waiting for a better position to come along.
And that there was more of that in the past than there is now.
Yeah, and my question is, I see people out of work who aren't able to even gain any kind of employment, and they fall out of the employment rolls. My second question, which I think relates to this, is don't we think, all of us, that banks like, companies like State Street Bank, that make their profits here, have some kind of an obligation to see that there's the education here to enrich our people and have them get the jobs rather than the Chinese?
They are related questions at the moment. Normally, I would say they wouldn't be. The thing is that when I was talking about theories of unemployment, those are theories of normal unemployment. Those are theories of 4.5% or 5% unemployment that we have during normal times. Right now is not a normal time. I would never argue that today the number of jobs that are out there are perfectly matched to the number of workers who want them. We're in an economic crisis. We're in the middle of the worst economic contraction in the post-war period, and the story is different. Trade policy, I would say, is not the way to deal with the lack of unemployment now. We need a much, much blunter instrument. Normally, in a situation like this would be the job of the Federal Reserve Bank, as I said before, to stimulate the economy through the monetary mechanism. But that all the bullets in that gun have been shot. It's empty. And so the only other mechanism that we have right now is fiscal policy, and no trade policy is going to, first of all, no trade policy is going to come close to filling the gap between our potential employment level and where our employment level is. And to the second thing is that the last thing in the world we want to do is to start down the road of trying to fill that gap by trade policy. We have previous experience with this in the Great Depression. All of the countries of the world tried to do that. They tried to export their unemployment to other countries. Before, remember my last talk, I talked about how actually the level of trade in the world prior to the Great Depression was actually up above where it was until just relatively recently. And what happened was that partly as a result of the collapse of the economies of the world, but also to a very large extent because of a huge growth in protectionism, the trade collapsed, and it took years and years of after the wars to get it back up to where it was before. So I don't think that it's a good idea to think of trade policy as employment policy for that reason. But we do need an employment policy. We desperately need an employment policy, and the one instrument that's left to us is government trying to pump on.
In terms of State Street, I think they would say that they actually make their money globally because they have customers all over the world, including China. And they would probably say that they have been very committed through the State Street Foundation and other things of trying to encourage more kids to major in certain things and trying to hire college students and internships and co-ops and so on. They've chosen recently that their new global priority for their philanthropy is employability, not only in the U.S. but all over the world. What can be done to help more people around the world have higher and more employable skills and so on?
One last question. There was a gentleman down here. Nope. Okay. Over there.
As someone who owned a manufacturing company, I can only tell you that the American manufacturing industry is as sophisticated, arguably, as anyone in the world. Your slide on steel production, I think, was an indicator. But every manufacturing company faces situations beyond their control, many of which we've mentioned in this class. Currency manipulation, dumping, tax policies, subsidies. These are things that individual companies cannot control. Government has to establish a method to deal with those issues.
This might be a good opportunity to mention, during the break, it was brought up that a lot of what we shared was kind of depressing. So I wanted to share, I was going to try to present some of it, but I didn't get the things in time. I mentioned earlier that the Dukakis Center conducted a study of the manufacturing sector in Massachusetts. And the findings of that are incredibly good news. I'm sharing this now because it's good to end on a up note. All these manufacturing firms throughout Massachusetts were surveyed, and then follow-up interviews with over 800 CEOs and owner-managers. And the good news is that in spite of what's been a decline over the decades, it looks like it's leveled out, with the exception of business cycle. It's leveled out. It might have slight decline, might even have slight growth, but it's leveled out at about 300,000 employees in Massachusetts. And a lot of the companies actually plan to grow over the next 10, 15 years. The research also helped us identify what are the real barriers that these manufacturing firms say they face, barriers they face to either staying in Massachusetts or growing. And we've been sharing those results with the governor and the other parts of the administration and the state legislative leaders. So that's encouraging. And then one last bit is when we added up the projected turnover, retirements, and so on, and some bit of job growth, over the next 10 years, Barry estimates there will be 100,000 job openings in manufacturing in Massachusetts alone. Now the challenge, though, is nobody's preparing people to go into those jobs. So we've been talking with the education system, including VOCAD and the VOCA technical systems, to make sure they know this, because if it really turns out and there are 100,000 job openings and they can't fill them, that'll be another reason to leave.
All right, thank you all for coming.